All right. Hi there, Epidemics. How's everybody doing today?
Are we in next week?
No?
Really? Really, man? Why are you
Really?
leaving us? Why are you leaving us? If I knew it was going to end like this, I would have never started.
Oh. Okay, so yes, this is the last week of classes. So we have class today, we have class on Thursday, and then we're done. And I kind of feel the same way, Jerry. Man, you guys have been good. You've been a good class. So it's always hard when a good class comes to an end. All right, so we do have a couple of assignments due before midnight on Sunday, as usual. Today, we're talking a little bit more about antibiotic resistance. And then we're going to talk about post-viral syndrome. So I know we've talked about antibiotic resistance a little bit before in this semester, but I'm going to go into a little more detail than we did earlier in the semester. So this is a friend of mine, and she's a field biologist. She got bitten by a ground squirrel, and the wound got infected with MRSA, which is an antibiotic resistant form of Staphylococcus aureus. She was in the hospital for more than a week. She had multiple surgeries, and eventually she had to have her finger amputated. You can see the scar tissue here from where they went in and pulled out, literally pulled out infected tissue. This is the skull of a ground squirrel. So it's not what we would normally think of as a dangerous animal, but it definitely caused her a big problem. Alexis, go ahead.
What exactly is MRSA? Because last summer my friend she worked at a doggy daycare and she got scratched by a dog or something and she ended up with MRSA. And she had like a huge rash all over her body. It was kind of scary to look at.
I can't ever remember the exact name of the antibiotic that's listed as the M. I like to call it multi-antibiotic resistant Staph aureus. What this means, Staphylococcus aureus is a very common bacteria. It usually your immune system can fight it off. It's on our skin pretty much all the time. And if we get an injury, a deep tissue wound, that bacteria can get inside the body, and that's where it tends to cause an infection. And the infection does result in a rash, swelling, inflammation, and it can cause a lot of other symptoms as well, because it does spread throughout the whole body. Most Staph aureus infections can be treated with antibiotics, but it has developed resistance to most of the antibiotics that are out there. And so if you get this infection inside your body, and it is antibiotic resistant, it's very hard to treat.
So I like to go to the public garden and feed the squirrels. I'm not doing that anymore now. It's a fun thing. They're so friendly because they're used to people, so they don't run away. It's a great It's a great activity to do, but after seeing this, I guess I decline.
Yeah, you throw the food on the ground, don't hand it to them.
Ah, smart. And one more thing. So
Yeah.
I got an alert that a Colorado inmate is the first human case of bird flu in the US.
Yes.
How he get in and he's in jail?
He was exposed through contact with poultry. So I don't
The
know
cook,
if
maybe?
I don't know exactly whether he worked with poultry before he got arrested, if he's the cook, if the jail has a flock of chickens, but it was close contact.
So this is the first case ever in history of a person getting a bird flu? I didn't understand the title or the headline rather well.
It's the first one for the current outbreak.
Okay.
Bird flu going from birds to humans is rare. I don't think we have an exact count, but I've seen estimates, and all the estimates I've seen are less than 50 people have gotten it directly from a bird.
So hyper rare. Okay.
Hyper rare, yes. Okay. So resistance means that the antibiotics don't work. And we have in the past few years found bacteria that are resistant to every single antibiotic that we know of. In the US, 35,000 deaths due to bacterial infections yearly. Worldwide, we estimate it's over 1 million. Once resistance shows up to a specific antibiotic, it sticks around. There's no going backwards. Once resistance exists, it exists. Alexander Fleming, in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech in 1945, said, quote, "The greatest possibility of evil in self-medication is the use of too small doses, so that instead of clearing up infection, the microbes are educated to resist penicillin, and a host of penicillin-fast organisms is bred out, which can be passed to other individuals and from them to others until they reach someone who gets a septicemia or a pneumonia, which penicillin cannot save." Septicemia is what my friend here had. It got into her bloodstream. So even in 1945, they knew that this was a risk. All right, screenshot if you want it.
Does she have lasting nerve damage, or does she have what they call shadow limb feelings and stuff like that, Professor?
I don't know. They tried to save her finger. It's only was amputated not that long ago. I haven't heard of any lasting neurological damage. I suspect there is some.
Okay, thank you.
She doesn't really want to talk about it right now. Okay, so how do we get antibiotic resistance? Well, the big answer is evolution. So bacteria learn or develop a mutation that allows them to change something of their biology that is specifically targeted by that antibiotic. So there's a mutation that changes the target of the antibiotic. Mutations are common. They happen all the time. When a mutation happens that changes the target of an antibiotic, if that bacteria is not in the presence of antibiotics, it may or may not persist. It may not be able to outcompete the other bacteria. But if there's antibiotic around, then the other bacteria that don't have resistance are no longer able to compete for resources. And there's an advantage for the bacteria that is antibiotic resistance. So these mutations can be things like change in the cell wall or membrane to reduce ability of an antibiotic to get into the cell. There can also be changes to pumps. So pumps are exactly what they sound like. Inside the cell, there are pumps that export and import various products. So export pumps are normally work on waste or exporting proteins like toxins. Pumps are expensive. They take a lot of energy. And you don't want to export too many stuff, but if there's antibiotics around and the pump modifies so that it is more active and it can export the antibiotics, that's an advantage. So a lot of bacteria mutate to be able to increase pump activity. And then they can get rid of that antibiotic. Mutations that produce resistance. 1 out of every 10 million cells. Now that sounds like these have got to be pretty rare. 10 million cells? How long do you think it takes from one bacteria to get to 10 million?
48 hours.
Less.
Wow. Well, they're
Six-
not so complex, so I guess it's easy to duplicate themselves.
Yep, it takes about 6 hours to produce 10 million bacteria from one. So in 6 hours, you can get a mutation that causes resistance. All right, you want to take a screenshot of this? So where did we get our antibiotics from originally? A lot of them are naturally produced by other microbes, other bacteria, or fungi. And they're used in the wild to reduce competition. So you're trying to not allow other bacteria to come near you. And usually these are produced in low amounts. We had to develop special techniques to extract the antibiotics, purify the antibiotics, or manufacture antibiotics to get high enough doses to be useful in our bodies. Okay, so I'm getting ready to go on to the next slide. This slide shows these little discs contain antibiotic, and the background, the hazy stuff, that's bacterial growth. So you can see these bacteria are susceptible to antibiotics. These are resistant. And the resistant ones either can get closer to the source of the antibiotic, so they can tolerate at least a low dose of it, or grow right over that antibiotic disc. No problem. So how did we get to a point where antibiotic resistance is such a scary, potentially horrific thing? In the US, until the mid-50s, Penicillin was available over the counter. What we call OTC, over the counter. You didn't need a prescription. You walked into the drugstore, you bought penicillin. It was also in everything. It was even promoted to do things like promote growth in children. So people would give it to their kids to get them to grow better. Even today, we still have problems with antimicrobials and antibiotics and things. I mean, look at these stupid products. Why do you need antimicrobial scissors? An antimicrobial stapler, antimicrobial tape. This is ridiculous. There's no reason to make these kinds of products. We also see it in things like kitchen countertops. We see it in clothing. We see it in children's toys. This is a huge concern. This is going to promote antibiotic resistance. Remember, soap and water gets rid of a lot of bacteria right there by itself. If you're cleaning the house, vinegar and bleach kill most bacteria. So all of those fancy products with antibiotics in them don't do any better than soap and water or vinegar or bleach. Okay, so that's one way that we have contributed to antibiotic resistance. You're welcome to take a screenshot, even though there's not a lot on that slide. We also have a huge overuse in medicine, both human and veterinary medicine. This shows how frequently antibiotics are prescribed to people. This is per 1,000 people. So these dark states, there's more than one prescription per person in a year. Some states, like the West Coast here, have significantly lower rates of prescription. We estimate that at least a third of all antibiotic prescriptions are unnecessary.
Nebraska going crazy out there.
Yes, yes. When antibiotics were first discovered, they were miracle drugs, and they really were. You had patients that had a disease, and you're like, oh my God, this patient's going to die on me. You give them antibiotics, and they turned around very, very quickly. So there's that community memory of how antibiotics saved lives, especially early in their development. And so doctors would use them for everything. They would use them for prevention. Sometimes this makes sense. If you're having certain types of surgery, this makes sense. You're at very high risk for septicemia, which is very nasty, or peritonitis, which is a very nasty infection of the inside of your abdominal cavity. But sometimes it doesn't make sense. You're getting your teeth cleaned. Do you really need antibiotics for teeth cleaning? You're getting stitches because you cut yourself. Do you really need antibiotics if they cleaned the wound and stitch it up? Doctors focus on individuals. So if there's a 5% chance that a bacteria that an antibiotic can be useful, they prescribe it just in case, right? because they're looking at one individual. If we're looking at society as a whole, what's good for society may be different than what is good for individuals. And we are not good at thinking that way. Okay, who gets nerd points for recognizing that quote? Oh my God, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of
Yeah,
the...
I've heard it. I don't know who said that. Was it a president?
No. It's from Star Trek. Spock said it.
Who is from Boston, by the way?
It was he. Oh, cool.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
did not
The
know
whole
that.
Museum of Science, they have a whole thing with him. He's the voiceover at the Omni Theater.
Cool.
Oh, you're in California, so. Sorry.
I lived in Massachusetts.
Oh yeah, cheers, cheers.
Yeah. Why do you think I'm teaching in Massachusetts? I left the college wouldn't let me go. Okay. What about public sanitation? Should we be using antibiotics to clean places? Again, some places make sense. Hospitals, doctors' offices, those make sense to use antibiotics because there's probably a lot of diseases going around. But again, it would be better to just use some cleaning product that kills bacteria and isn't an antibiotic. How about public transit, schools? How often are those places really cleaned? Not enough. And when we think about this, I think I've mentioned this. Antibiotic resistance can be carried around a hospital on doctors' shoes or on ties or lab coats. How often do you wash your tie? How often do you wash your shoes? How often do you think your doctor washes his lab coat? And remember, some exposure to germs is good for your immune system. So you want some exposure. You don't want to be too clean, but I'd rather my house be dirty than public transit. Because at least in my house, the germs are things that I or my cats had. Less likely to be something nasty. And then there's individual issues. So when people go to the doctor, many patients ask for antibiotics. They want those antibiotics because they think that's going to treat whatever is going on. It's been shown recently that most ear infections aren't responsive to antibiotics and go away on their own. But if your kid is screaming because they've got an ear infection, you're going to be yelling at the doctor for drugs. Up to 40% of patients quit antibiotics before they're done. that can increase resistance. They quit because they feel better or because they have side effects. And of course, in a lot of places around the world, you can still buy antibiotics at the drugstore. So that's the overuse issue in medicine. Okay. It gets worse. Screenshot. The role of agriculture. Around 1950, an experiment showed that chickens given a broad spectrum antibiotic grew bigger and faster. So what did chicken farmers do? They wanted the antibiotics, right? Got the same results with pigs. So now pig farmers want those antibiotics. And pharmaceutical companies started making nutritional supplements with tetracycline. Jerry, is your hand up?
Yes. So I watched a documentary on women from India, and the culture likes women to be a bit more Rubenesque. So they take these things you're talking about, which are not for humans, and it makes them a bit, chunkier, and it's killing them. So this is interesting to see the origin of it.
Yeah. Wow. I didn't know I didn't know about the problem in India. Oh, not so good. Okay. So this became widespread to give low doses to farm animals. Low doses strongly select for antibiotic resistance. You can have a mutation that allows you to survive low doses of an antibiotic, much easier than surviving high doses of an antibiotic. And this also allowed farmers to pack animals in tighter quarters. Because before they were using antibiotics, you couldn't pack them in too tight because they would get sick and they would spread the disease all around. But using the antibiotics, you could cram them in. So the antibiotics end up in the waste products, i.e. the feces, the manure. And what do you think happens to pig manure?
Fertilizer for us, for the plants we eat.
Fertilizer is one thing. Pig manure is pretty nasty, and they put it in what are called lagoons. Basically, they put it in ponds to let the solids settle out. And then you get a big storm and the ponds flood. So it ends up in the waterways. It ends up in local streams and ponds, eventually into the ocean. And so now these antibiotics are not just selecting for resistance on the farm, they're selecting for antibiotic resistance in bacteria out there in the wild. In 1971, the UK banned the use of antibiotics as growth factors. So they could use them if an animal got sick, but not just routine. Well, guess what happened? The usage of antibiotics, the amount of antibiotics being used did not go down. people were still using them, saying it was prophylactic to prevent infections. In the US, the FDA was moving to follow suit, and Representative Jamie Whitten stated that he would hold the budget of the FDA hostage if they passed any regulations. And I don't know exactly why he was able to hold the budget of the FDA hostage, but he could, and the FDA caved. So in the US, it took till 2012 for the US to have regulations on the use of antibiotics in agriculture. And immediately afterwards, use of antibiotics went up. You can pass the laws, but if you don't enforce them, it doesn't matter. Recent studies are showing that when you compare chickens that are given antibiotics to chickens who are not given antibiotics, there's no longer a difference in growth. So why is it that back then antibiotics helped and nowadays they don't? Helped with growth. Any ideas?
Maybe the chickens mutated and that benefit from the antibiotics they do genetically now?
How about the gut bacteria mutated?
Oh, something mutated.
Yep. Also, we have improved hygiene in our farm conditions. We have improved disease monitoring. We have improved nutrition compared to the 1950s for the farm animals. So the farm animals nowadays are healthier than they were in the 1950s. And yeah, there's probably some genetics involved in breeding more meaty chickens as well. Okay, so that's the overuse of antibiotics in agriculture. Screenshot, and it gets worse. Groceries. So 50s, 60s, 70s, into the 80s, antibiotics would be injected or painted onto raw meat to increase the shelf life. Some milk had so much penicillin that it was at therapeutic doses. So not low doses, but the kind of doses that you would be given if you had an infection. And of course, some people are allergic to penicillin, so that was really bad for a lot of kids. So you think you're safe because you're a vegetarian? Spinach and other vegetables were washed in antibiotics. Fortunately, this is no longer allowed. So this is no longer contributing to antibiotic resistance. So we know now, here we're at the end of the class, and we know that antibiotic resistance, the more widespread it gets, the worse things are going to be. Because we know that half of all children born would die, mostly of infectious diseases, mostly before the age of 5. Antibiotic resistance could theoretically get bad enough to take us back to those days. But there is hope. I'm not going to leave this topic on a bad bad note. Some people are using what's called machine learning to identify new antibiotics. The antibiotics we haven't found a lot of new targets in the past 60 or 70 years. We've just been improving the ability to go after the same targets. So we're using machine learning to try and find new and interesting targets and design drugs that could go after them. There's some interesting possibilities coming down the pike. This is a relatively new way of looking for drugs, and so far we don't have anything yet, but we have some interesting possibilities. Probiotic therapy, also known as fecal transplants. Turns out that a lot of chronic infections in the digestive tract, specifically C. diff infections, as well as certain other conditions like Crohn's disease, that seems to be related to having our microbiome disturbed. And introducing a healthy microbiome from another person can help treat that. And this one is being actively used, and it works wonders for things like C. diff. We're starting to use combination therapies, medications that can block the resistance mechanisms. So those pumps I was talking about, if you have a medication that slows down or turns off those pumps that are pumping the antibiotic out of the cell, then the antibiotic can work again. Stimulating an immune response. I put some question marks here because an overactive immune system results in autoimmune disease. And autoimmune diseases are on the rise. I always think it's funny when I see commercials for stuff that boosts your immune systems, and I'm like, no, thank you. I want my immune system working at the right level. I don't want it boosted. I don't want an autoimmune disease. And here's the latest thing that I've learned about. Phage therapy. Phage is the same thing as bacteriophage, which means it's a virus that goes after bacteria. Everything has viruses that go after them. So great, we can infect you with a virus that kills bacteria. Now, the tricky part is finding a phage that goes after one specific bacteria. This might sound like an absolutely overwhelming prospect to find that. Well, it kind of is, and there's certainly trillions of different phages, but this has been used successfully in patients who were dying of antibiotic-resistant bacterial infections. And it is currently used regularly in Poland, and in the country of Georgia. So some places are already using this, at least somewhat frequently. There's also the hope that we can genetically modify phages to go after specific bacteria. We're much better equipped to genetically modify viruses than genetically modify any other types of organisms. So that's a good sign of hope. Okay, so that's wrapping up antibiotic resistance. Any questions, thoughts, comments? Everybody's being quiet today.
No, I'm sorry, I was screen share. I was saying, so you're saying that we can engineer one of the most deadliest things known to man to help us?
Mm-hmm.
And when you engineer it, like how, I don't understand, what do you do to it to change it? Like what, I don't understand that.
Okay. So if you've got a bacterial genetic material, DNA or RNA, because the amount of DNA or RNA, the number of genes is very, very small, it's very easy to insert a gene from another organism. So we aren't at the point. Okay, let me back that up. That we know how to design virus genes so that they make a specific protein.
Wow.
So if we know there's a specific protein that we want to go after, we can insert that gene into the virus, into their DNA. So they now have that gene.
Now, this may sound weird, but are genes all the same size?
No,
Okay.
some are small, some are
Size
huge.
32, 34, 36. No, I'm just kidding. Genes.
That was good. That's good. That's good. So is it gene rejection? Is that such a thing? Like gene splicing rejection, if that's even a correct phrase?
You mean, does the virus kick out a gene?
Yeah, like so if you're trying to put your gene into mine, simple, could my body reject your gene and it not work?
Yes.
Compatibility is the question I'm asking. It's more simple.
Okay. In humans, compatibility is a concern.
Okay, but not virus.
Depending on the gene. Some genes, that's not an issue, but the bigger problem with people is we have trillions of cells. You could put genes for blonde hair color into some of your cells, but is it going to, it's much harder to do in people. Our genetics is much more complicated. It's much, much bigger. And it may or may not work. We haven't successfully genetically modified people yet.
And also the immune system does not interact with genes at all. Because, you know, like say my aunt got a heart transplant and she has anti-rejection medicine. So I wonder how does that come to play in respect to genes?
Okay. With transplants, on all of our cells, there are proteins that are there, that one of their roles is to identify that cell as belonging to you. So all of the cells in your body, Jerry, have little labels on the surface that say, these are Jerry cells.
Mhm.
If you get a heart, let's say you get a kidney from Nate, Nate's kidney has little tags that say, these cells belong to Nate. Your immune system will recognize that those are not Jerry cells and go after them.
We're just not compatible, Jerry. I'm sorry.
Thanks for giving it to me, though. I'm sorry I wasted it, bro.
So that's why the anti-rejection drugs. Viruses don't have an immune system. We don't have to worry about that with them.
Oh, so they're indestructible. They don't need an immune system.
So
they come in contact with heat.
Yeah, I was going to say they're destructible, all right, but
I mean, right. That was a overstatement. I'm just saying they don't worry about those type of things.
No, they're smaller than a single cell. They don't even have cells. So they're very, very simple. Nate, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just kind of had a question regarding like the immune system and heat in relation to pathogens. So is part of the reason why when we're sick, our body temperature rises is a mechanism to try to kill those harmful cells? Or is the body temperature rise just a byproduct of being sick?
A little of both. So raising the body temperature, a lot of bacteria in particular have an upper heat tolerance. So if our body temperature gets too high, that kills off the bacteria. A high temperature also increases the speed at which our immune system functions. So it speeds everything up, which can help.
That was a great explanation. Thank you.
You're welcome. So Jerry, did I answer your question good enough, going way back about the genetics of viruses?
No, absolutely. I just think it's so cool how things that ail us, we can just turn into something that aid us. From ailing to aiding.
Yep. Most viruses don't harm us, though. Most of them don't.
It's the bacteria, huh?
Well, even most bacteria don't.
That's true.
All right. Any other questions on bacteria, immune system, yada, yada, yada?
So bacteria, go ahead, Captain.
Oh, it's not a question, but right after you finished talking about your friend and squirrels, I saw this on my feed. I opened up my phone and it's like with their hand in a squirrel's mouth.
Yeah, don't mess with squirrels.
So bacteria give off waste. Do viruses give off waste?
No.
What are those things then? I don't understand.
Yeah, they are shells of mostly protein with some genetic information inside. That's it. They're kind of somewhere in between complex chemicals and living organisms.
I love that explanation. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. So all of my life, at least, the idea has been you get an infection, you get better, and that's the end of that. You're done. Well, it turns out that's not always the case. And there are a couple of things that can happen after an acute infection. An acute infection is the stage where you feel sick. You can get post-infection syndrome. You can get autoimmune conditions. You can get cancer. So all of these things can happen months or even years after an infection. So we're going to start talking about post-infection syndrome. And this is a collection of symptoms. When we say syndrome, it's a collection. Oops, somebody's in the chat. Okay. It's a collection of symptoms without a clear, obvious cause. So if you hear fibromyalgia syndrome, we don't know what causes that, but there's a bunch of symptoms that go together. Sometimes there are multiple causes. So there can be different things that cause the same collection of symptoms. When we're talking about post-infection syndrome, we're talking about fatigue, pain, cognitive difficulty. Those are the big three symptoms that tend to go with this. When I say fatigue, I don't mean tired like we're all tired at the end of the semester tired. I mean tired to the point where you have to decide, am I going to take a shower today? Or am I going to make dinner for myself rather than order takeout? So it's severe fatigue. Pain, the pain can be mild, it can be severe. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with injuries. And cognitive refers to the brain. So it can be difficulty thinking, difficulty decision making, all of those sorts of things. A lot of these post-infection syndromes, people have a highly active immune system, or even evidence of an autoimmune condition. So you don't want to boost your immune system. This category includes things like chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, post-treatment Lyme disease, post-Ebola syndrome, as if having Ebola wasn't bad enough, and long COVID. Some of these categories, because we can't find a specific, clear cause or an objective test for them, we have to trust the patient's symptoms. These get called wastebasket diagnoses. It's like, I don't know what's wrong with you, so I'm going to call it chronic fatigue. These conditions are all more common in women than men. They are not well understood. And because they're not well understood, because they get called a wastebasket diagnosis, and frankly, because they impact women more than men, there is stigma. And there's frequent misclassification as a psychological problem. It's all in your head. This is especially true with chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia, because we can't say, well, this person had Lyme disease or Ebola or COVID. When we know there was an infection that causes these symptoms, we have, there's a clear link there. We don't know what causes chronic fatigue. We don't know what causes fibromyalgia. So a lot of doctors are just like, that's not real. In addition to that, we can't measure symptoms of pain and fatigue. And we can measure to some degree cognitive difficulty. But for pain and fatigue, you have to trust the patient. Trust that they are telling you the truth. And some people think, oh, they're just exaggerating. They're claiming to be fatigued because they don't want to clean the house. A lot of these conditions can last for years. In some cases, they can be lifelong. These are the modern forms of the wandering uterus. You guys heard that term before?
Never.
It used to be that diseases that impacted women more than men were said to be caused by a wandering uterus. It was kind of a way to just say, oh, it's a woman problem. We don't need to worry about it. Nate, I see your hand up.
Yeah, that kind of goes back to what I touched on in my presentation regarding the overprescription of opium for women's illnesses.
Mm-hmm.
Also, just a little sidebar. When I think of wandering uterus, I just think of a uterus with a stick with like the handkerchief tied to it. A vagabond.
Okay, yeah, that would make a cute image. All right, so go ahead and clear this. Or I'm sorry, screenshot this. I'm going to clear it. So I'm going to specifically focus on long COVID. Stupid little bars. It's not clearly defined yet, but it includes symptoms that last more than a month or start after the initial symptoms clear up. We have no idea how long this can last. 1 year after mild infections, 25% of patients report long COVID. 25% of people 1 year after getting a mild COVID infection are still experiencing symptoms. If you're vaccinated, that number goes down to 1 in 5 or 20%. So even if you're vaccinated, it's still a problem. And of people with long COVID, at least half of them have symptoms that last more than a year. And some people have had them basically since the beginning of the pandemic. Symptoms, of course, are highly, highly variable. Fatigue, weakness, joint pain. Nate, go ahead.
Just had a question. That term above cough, dyspnea, what is that? Is that a decreased breathing rate or lower oxygen intake?
Abnormal breathing would be the best way to put it.
Okay, thanks. I'd never seen that before.
Yeah. Kat, you're in the way.
That brain fog is real though. After I had COVID, I had that for like 2 weeks with mild cold symptoms that just did not go away. It wasn't a good time, but I'm grateful it's subsided.
Oh yeah, yeah. Sleep disturbances, PTSD, anxiety, brain fog, headaches. With COVID, we can add chest pains, heart arrhythmias, thromboembolism. This basically means that you're getting blood clots in your blood vessels. Those clots can get clogged can cause clogs in small vessels, which can cause strokes or literally all kinds of damage depending on where those clots end up. So if they end up, you can get deep vein thrombosis. They can go to your lungs, your brain, all kinds of places. Chronic kidney disease, and even hair loss, which is kind of strange.
Wasn't myocarditis another one of those? Because I remember there was a period of time where there was like 3 soccer players in Europe that all had like heart conditions that had previous like COVID infections. It all happened around like the same time.
Yes. Post-COVID heart conditions are turning out to be disturbingly common. Yeah. Myocarditis means the heart muscles are inflamed.
I think pericarditis, a similar condition, was also something that was abundant as well.
Yeah, the pericardium is, so pericarditis is an inflammation of the membrane that wraps around the heart. You can also have gastrointestinal problems. The fatigue by itself occurs in 60% of the long COVID cases. The cognitive difficulties include getting sensory overload so bad that you can't concentrate when you go shopping. Lots of places are starting to define this as a disability. We do not think that long COVID is an autoimmune condition. So we have an idea of what's going on, and I'm going to let you guys take a screenshot if you want it, and then we're going to go on to what probably is going on with long COVID. And that is mast cell activation syndrome. So again, we have syndrome, which means this can be caused by a lot of different things. We don't understand it well. So mast cells are a type of white blood cell. So remember, the white blood cells are part of the immune system. Normally, they work in the innate immune system. So the early defense, and they recognize or detect new foreign invaders. So new bacteria, new viruses, new stuff. And mast cell activation syndrome has effects on a lot of different systems. So we call it multi-system effects. System. Oh, come on. So it can cause skin rashes and itchiness. It can cause constriction of your the vessels in your lungs. It can cause blood vessels to dilate or open up. It can increase secretions in your stomach so that your stomach becomes more acidic, which leads to things like heartburn, gastric reflux. So the mast cells release histamine. Have you heard of histamine before? You heard of antihistamines before?
Yes.
Yes. So histamines trigger all of these inflammation processes. These are all ways that histamine causes your body to react to reduce your risk of getting a severe infection, to help your immune system fight off that infection.
Isn't Benadryl one of those antihistamines?
Yes,
Oh, okay.
yes. And so we say this causes allergy-like symptoms. And sometimes these can be responses to things that would not normally cause an allergy. Things like changes in temperature can trigger these symptoms in somebody with mast. Mast cell activation syndrome. I am not doing well on the typing today. Okay, so we are seeing this condition in patients with long COVID. And so early work is showing that antihistamines are reducing symptoms. The early work shows that they reduce symptoms in 72% of long COVID patients. So if you've got long COVID, you can certainly take antihistamines. It's not clear which ones work best. Some work, some don't. They work in some people, but not in other people. It's still early days, but you know, if it was me, I'd be trying Claritin, Benadryl, you know, whatever. And I'm not big on saying try random drugs, but long COVID is nasty. And if you can treat the symptoms at least, you know. Nate, go ahead.
Just a little personal reflection here. I think well, the word fascinating may not be appropriate, but I think what's fascinating about COVID is just the wide range of symptoms that it can cause, because I had it and I got hives all over my chest and torso. It was crazy. They were so itchy and red, like it literally like all up here on my chest. And you know, luckily that Benadryl did the trick, but yeah, it was not fun.
That's probably related to mast cell overstimulation. Yep. It also causes blood clots, which can cause symptoms in all kinds of different parts of the body.
Yep, I got that D-dimers test done. Luckily that came back good. So that definitely was a concern, those blood clots.
Yep. Okay. Whew. Any other questions on this one? All right. Take your screenshot. This was the least gross picture I could find. So we don't think that long COVID is an autoimmune thing. It's overstimulation of the immune system, yes. Or at least it looks that way now. It's early days, things may change. But autoimmune diseases also seem to come up after certain types of infections. An autoimmune disease is any disease where your immune system attacks your cells. And the diseases are categorized based on which of your cells your immune system is going after. There are over 80 known autoimmune diseases. And they include things like lupus. Oops. Rheumatoid arthritis, celiac disease, multiple sclerosis, type 1 diabetes, psoriasis, like this person, Lots and lots and lots of them. They are more common in women. They tend to start in adulthood, although type 1 diabetes can start in childhood, of course. They run in families. So there is a genetic component. So there's something that it makes you susceptible to developing these. Around 24 million people in the US have at least one of these. That's 1 out of every 15. It's a very complicated situation. Treatment can reduce the symptoms, but there's no cure. So I want to talk about multiple sclerosis specifically. So go ahead and screenshot this. Okay, so multiple sclerosis, it's written up here, or MS, is an autoimmune disease that is related to infection by Epstein-Barr virus. So Epstein-Barr is a relative of herpes. In young adults, this is what causes mono. So if you've had mono, you've had the Epstein-Barr virus. It's a very widespread virus. Most of us get infected with it at some point in our lives. What we have discovered, however, is that when we look at multiple sclerosis, we see antibodies that bind to a protein in the nervous system. And this disrupts communication. So it's not actually targeting the nerve fibers, it's targeting the wrapping around the nerve fibers. So if you look at power cords, there's a layer around the outside, and on the inside there are copper wires. Well, your nerves have that sort of stuff as well, an insulator. And if that insulation breaks down, that can screw up the nerve's ability to conduct signals. So this results in multiple sclerosis, in muscle weakness. Oh shit. Fatigue and numbness. And I just looked at the clock and we're out of time again. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit more about MS. We're going to talk about cancers caused by infections, and we're going to talk about possible endings to the COVID pandemic. Any other questions before we head out?
I thought MS was scars on your brain.
It can cause scars on your brain, yes.
Oh, okay.
You have nerve tissue in your brain.
Right.
So it's just basically this going on in your brain.
Sucks, man. I had a friend, he couldn't walk some days, he can walk other days. It was wild.
Yeah, it's a nasty disease.
Have a good day, y'all.
Bye, Nate.
All right, see you guys next 2 days from now.
2 days from now, last class.
Yep.